Okay, so we are on Daf Tes Amud Aleph. We're halfway down. So thank you so much. So let's see where we are up to. We got up to I believe we're up to the Ema Shachte L'Shem Toida. I think we're up to the Ema Shachte L'Shem Toida, but just to be sure, I'll go to the Ema Shachte L'Shem Tumura. So we're in the middle of discussing the Korban Pesach that was that's not in the time of to bring the Korban Pesach. So, for instance, you don't bring it, and now it's after Pesach. So we learned the pasuk tells you that the halacha is l'zevach shlam mekrivu, meaning that if you have a korban pesach that's no longer a korban pesach, you can't bring it for a korban pesach anymore. You bring it as a korban shlomim. So the Gemara wants to know if l'zavach is just a riboy that says you could bring it for any zevach. Maybe it's not a shlomim. Maybe you could have kavanah that it should be a temura. Dr. Gemara, temura. Now we know a temura is not a korban. Temura is in exchange for a korban. So the Brisker Rav learns that this temura means a temura of a meiser, and it'll soon become clear why the Brisker Rav learns it's truma of a meiser. Is it nageya that it becomes a temura? Number one is lamilka. There's an iser to make a temura. So if you make a temura even in this non-conventional fashion, like by repurposing a korban pesach, inam you get malchus for that because you made a temura. Inami lameikam alei below yimacher below yigoyel. Now the pasuk of lo yimacher below yigoyel is a pasuk that's referring to ma'aser behema. So that's why the Brisker Rav learns that the temura here that you made was a temura of ma'aser behema, and therefore it should have the din of ma'aser behema. Although there are those who are not goyers, this inami lameka malay below yimacha below yigoyel, but that's what it would be telling you.
Amen.
Well, thank you very much. So Amar Marzutra Bareda of Nachman Amar Kra, the pasuk teaches us Zut Tamura. The only thing that can become Tamura is something that actually is used to swap the kedusha of a korban onto. But they nachar Tamura. There's no other way to create a temura. There's no artificial way to create a temura like by repurposing a korban pesach. Frank the Gemara, the ema shachte l'shem toida lahavaki toida. Maybe if you shachted it l'shem toida, it should be a toida. L'mahilchasa latina lechem, that it should require the 40 breads. Oh, now I remember we did do the yesterday. Zok to Gemara mika midi. Is there a thing the Pesach ufei loy boy lachem? A korban pesach wouldn't need lachem. Umoishrei boy lachem, and the leftover korban pesach should require lechem, when a korban pesach itself doesn't require lechem. Zok Gemara, if you're going to ask that kasha, so then you can't be like meiser or buchar or anything. You can't even be like a shlomim, because the hachi hashtanami mi kamidi the Pesach ufei loy boy nisachem umoishrei boy nisachem. If you're repurposing this korban pesach and it's becoming a shlomim, it will need nesachim. A Pesach does not require nesachim. Zok Gemara anan hachi kamin. This is what we need to argue. Why we know that the korban Pesach cannot be a korban toida that requires breads, because mi ikomidi the moiser toida atzma loy boilach. If someone had a korban toida that was extra, for instance, he had a korban toida and he lost it, and then he replaced it with a different korban toida that he was then makriv. After that, he found a toida. Now, when you're makriv that toida, like a shlomim, you don't need lechem with it. So the toida itself that was left over doesn't need lechem. Vilu moiser da'asiluma alma boy lechem. But a korban pesach that was repurposed into a toida would require lechem. That's where we left off. And I pointed out that Tosfos has a kasha. What about the fact that a shlomim is eaten for 2 days and 1 night, and the korban toida is only eaten for 1 day and 1 night? So Tosfos asks us right at the beginning, Ushlama abayim achas pesach l'chol mitzvah shlomim pirish bekutris chagigas arba osa. which referring to a little bit later in the Gemara. But Taisa says over here, Upirish B'Kudu Shama Pesach Hagir Shidal. The Gemara wants to compare it to Shama Chagiga, which we'll see in a minute. It's a little bit later than what we didn't learn yet. But he says, Beferish, the caution to Psachim Be'il Dvarim Darish Mikra Behedya De Chagigas Yudald Nechelos L'Shnei Yomim V'Lai Le'echad, which is Kanim Beperek Ubasar Zevach Beferish Ubasar Zevach Tadish Shlomo Mar Bechagigas Yudald L'Shnei Yomim V'Lai Le'echad U'Shlomo B'Machbasar L'Yoyim V'Layla V'Nir Devada Shalmei Pesach L'Chol Apsulin Hainu Moiser Pesach Hahid Tzeders Kahanim Gabi Chamisha Shenashar V'Orish Peschayim, and it says over there, no matter what, the Moshe Pesach, even though we say it as the din of a shlomim, it's only nechal l'yoyim v'layla, not l'shnei yomim v'layla echad, and therefore it wouldn't be any different than the carbon toida. I just have to adjust the camera here for a second. Sagt der Heilige Gemara weiter. Sagt der Heilige Gemara weiter. Maskef law, Rabbi Yemar, Bored Rav Hillel. Umimayde b'Moshe Pesach ksiv. How do we know that we're speaking about Moshe Pesach? Which is ve'iminat tzoin karbonai. If it's a carbon shlomim that came from the carbon Pesach, which only comes from tzoin. Maybe something else only comes from tzoin. Dilma b'Moshe also ksiv. Maybe we're not talking about Moshe Pesach in this pasuk. Maybe we're talking about Moiser Osham. Maybe it was an Osham that was left over. Amarav Amakra, it says Ve'im min hatzoin karbonai lezevach shlomim. And we learn Dover Hashava B'chol Hatzoin. It's something that you could bring any type of tzoin for. There's kvasim and there's kvasim and there's seirim. One's goats, one's sheep. I don't know exactly what it is, but a tzoin can refer to two types of things, either kvasim or izim. So only a korban pesach could be brought out of kol tzoin. But an osham could be brought to osham nami ayil tamim min azachu ve'neba min abacher. So an osham is an ayil, but it's not kol hatzoin. So therefore, it can only refer to the korban pesach. So Amarav Makra bimin hatzoin karbonai l'zevach shlomim davar hashava l'chol hatzoin. Maskal for Rab Avin bar Chia v'teimer Rab Avin bar Kana. B'chol aser, everywhere you teach us at Amrit that min is lahaitzi, min is to be mayit. We're saying minat tzoin cannot be referring to Osham, which only refers to some tzoin. Rather, it has to be referring to carbon pesach, which could be brought from all tzoin. But minat tzoin always means a subset of tzoin. That's how you normally learn. The chan min l'rabbis. And here you're saying min means not a subset of tzoin. Rather, all types of tzoin. Sai, seirim, and sai kvasim. That doesn't make any sense. If anything, it's more mustav that it should be an Osham, which could only be brought of minat tzoin from some tzoin. Amramani hachanami, here also minat tzoin is loitzi. Of course, it means minat tzoin from all of the tzoin, but not all of the tzoin. Lahaitzi Yosy page station. A korban pesach cannot be brought from an animal that's more than a year old, and Yosy nekeva, and a female animal is not brought as a korban pesach. So to minat tzoin, the tzoin is all species of tzoin, but from all species of tzoin, only some of them would be allowed to be used as a korban pesach if it's a year old or if it is male, and if it's male. So therefore, the Bim Tzoin is still referring to a korban pesach. Maskef law Rab Chana Bagdiso. Limatus Omrit the Chik Siv Hai the Moshe Pesach Siv. Are you going to tell me the Im Min Hatzoin Karbonoi must be referring to a korban pesach, Moshe Pesach? But Medichsiv, it says in the pasuk, Im Kesef v'Im Eis. This is in that same sugya of the korban shlomim. It says later on, Im Kesef v'Im Eis. Im Kesef hu makriv as karbon v'ikr Hashem, and it goes through the halachas of a kesef. One of the halachas is is that the tail is brought on the Mizbeach, and then the pasuk goes on after a couple of psukim concluding the parsha from Kesav Umakriv. The pasuk goes on and says Vim Eis Karbanoi, and then it goes through the halachas of if you brought an Eis for the Korban Shlomim. The problem is Michlal Dalal b'Moshe Pesach. It can't be referring to Moshe Pesach. You know why? Because do I need the Torah to tell me over here that a Korban Pesach can be brought either from a Kesef or an Eis? We already know in the parsha of Korban Pesach, the Torah already tells us Mina Kvasim or Mina Izim. So if we're thinking about Korban Pesach, then it shouldn't have to say again the option of Vim Kesef or Vim Eis, because we know that already from Korban Pesach. So if anything, it's probably not referring to a Korban Pesach. Zok Gemara, no, Haomi Boyle, not coming to tell us that you could bring a Shlomim as a Pesach from a Keves or an Eis. No, it tells you a different Chiddush. Lichidetanya, like we learned a different Chiddush in a Brisa. Lichidetanya Kesef, so it changes from Kevesh to Kesef. Kesef, L'Rabois Es HaPesach L'Alya. If the Korban Pesach is brought out of a Keves, its tail is brought. The tail is brought on the Mizbech if it's a Keves. Kishu Omer im Kasev L'Rabois Pesach She'ibra Shnosa. So the im tells us that you have to bring the tail on the Mizbech. And that's what it actually says in the Psukim of the im Kesef Umakriv as Karbana Vigavash Lefnei Hashem. So it gives the details of how you treat such a korban, and one of the psukim there says, and you actually are makriv the aliyah, the tail, onto the mizbeach. Now, kishu omer im kesev, the im before the word kesev is also marba l'rabbi's pesach she'ibr shnasa, to tell you that a pesach that's already more than a year old and is no longer qualified to be brought as a korban pesach, u'shlomim haboyin machmas pesach, and the shlomim that you bring along with the korban pesach, which Rashi and Tosfos tell us is referring to the Shalmei Chagiga that you brought together with the Korban Pesach, which is where Tosfos comments that it's only Nechal L'Yoyim V'Layla Echad L'Chol Mitzvah Shlomim. They have all the halachas of a regular Korban Shlomim. Sheyatinu Smicha Unesachim Utnufas Chazav V'Shaik. Now, the first question that you have to ask yourself is: we just said from V'im Min Atzayin Karbanai that Moiser Pesach becomes a shlomim. Now we're saying that from im kesev also tells you the same halacha. Pesach shir b'shnasa u'shlomim aboy machmas Pesach have the halacha of the whole mitzvah shlomim. So that's going to be a kasha that the Gemara is going to ask him. And then kishu omer im eis, which is it says v'meis karbanai, which is after the Torah talks about a little bit how you bring the carbon if it's a kesev. Hifsek inyan. It's mafsek the inyan between kesef and eis, limit ala eis she'ena tu'aya, to tell you that if the carbon is an eis, then you don't bring the tail of the eis is not put on the mizbeach. The tail of the kesef is put on the mizbeach, but not of the eis. I think the eis is a goat. Right? A goat tail won't be put on the mizbeach, but a sheep tail will be put on the mizbeach. Freit the Gemara, the Vahama Helcha Nafka. Are you telling me that we learn from Ve'im Min Atzoyin Karbanoi, or you learn from Im Pesach that Moiser Pesach goes l'Shomim? Fakert mi Avoda Shmuel Nafka. We just learned yesterday from Avoda Shmuel. Ve'im Min Atzoyin Karbanoi. L'Zevach Shlomim tells you that Davar Abba Min Atzoyin L'Zevach Shlomim. So we have now. Avoda Shmuel says you learned out of the Im and Atzayin Karbanai, and now you have this brisa that says you learn it out of Im Kesef. Im Kesef l'Rabbi's Pesach Shebishnasa. So Zok to Gemara. V'akati midrav Nachman Amar Bavu Nachman. And you know what? We have a third makor to the same halacha. We have a third makor that we also learned a couple of blot ago from Rab Nachman that teaches us that Moiser Shlomim becomes a Pesach. The Amar Rab Nachman Amar Rabba Baravua, Minayin l'Moiser Pesach Shekar Shlomim Shenemar v'Zavachto Pesach L'Shem L'Kecha Tzoynu Vakar. And the Gemara asks, what do you mean Tzoynu Vakar? You can't bring a Tzoynu Vakar for a Korban Pesach. But lo in Pesach ba ela minak kvasim oy minayizim ela mikan. You know what you see from here that lemoiser a Pesach sheyehela davar. If you have an extra Pesach, you know what carbon you should bring it for? You should bring it for a carbon that could be brought habom and atonim bakar. What type of carbon can be brought from a toinen bakar? Umayni u'shlamim. So now you have three psukim that all tell you the same thing. That Moshe Pesach goes l'shlamim. And l'klasa kroigsi. There's three psukim. Why would I need three psukim to tell me exactly the same halacha that Moshe Pesach goes l'shlamim? Zok to Gemara, very simple. Chad le'ibra zmanoi. It's no longer Pesach. It's already after Pesach. And Vivish Nasai. And this animal is also too old. So it's completely disqualified from being brought as a carbon. What happens if it's Ibris Manai, meaning it's past carbon, it's past Pesach, but it's not too old? Now you can think about how is that possible? Next year it's already too old, it's in the second year. But it would be good for Pesach Sheni. It would still be good for Pesach Sheni. It's still a young animal, and you could still reuse it for a Pesach Rishon. But even there, so why did it become Ois Pesach? Because you were monatic. You specifically said, I want to bring it for a Shlamim. That you could also do. With Shrichi, you need all three psukim. Because of Achman Echad, if we only had one of these three psukim, we would apply it to the case where it was the smallest chiddush. Havamina hechad ibrish nasei uzmanoi. You know what the one pasuk is referring to? A case where it's completely removed from a korban pesach. Sai, it's too old. Sai, it's not the season. The itchim pesach lagamri. That's where the Torah says it becomes a shlamim. Aval ibrish anoi v'leishnasoi, or vice versa. The chazil pesach sheni can be brought as the pesach sheni. Eimaloi, maybe it still retains its status as a korban pesach. Kamashalon becomes a shlamim because of Rachman and Tarti. Because these no longer can be its original plan of korban pesach. The chazul pesach it can still be brought as a korban pesach. You would think that you can't make it into a shlamim. Shrichi, you could still say specifically, I want to change it into a shlamim and bring it as a shlamim, and it'll be good. So we have three separate lemudim that pesach becomes a shlamim because we need it for three layers of chiddush, the biggest of which is that even if it's still a kosher or korban pesach, and it can be brought right now as a korban pesach, you can say, no, I don't want to bring it for a korban pesach, I want to change it. Amarav mishmei de mavug. Chatos sheshachta l'shum chatos nachshay. You shechted a korban chatos and you unbind, it want to be l'shum chatos nachshay. And what is the chatos of nachshay? The chatos that the Nesiim brought were called chatos nachshan. When they were opening up the Mishkan for the first time, all of the Nesiim brought karbanos, and one of their karbanos was a chatos. We call it chatos nachshan, Rashi tells us, because out of all the Nesiim, he was the first one to bring it, so therefore we refer to all those chatos as nachshan. So it's not a chatos chelav, it's not a standard chatos for an avera. They didn't do an avera, they were mechayiv to bring a chatos, but they still brought a chatos. So it's a chatos that you shechted, shaloi l'shem kodesh, meaning not for your korban chatos, but for a different type of korban chatos. So zogt mavuk, kshera, it's kosher. You know why? The yomakra zois teres chatos. Torah achas l'chol chatos. Yes, it's not the same chatos. It's not on chiv korish. But you know what? As long as you have kavanah for a chatos, for anything in the chatos family, that is enough to be a kosher korban. Yosef Rava v'komer lo lahosh ma'itza. Rava said over this halacha, and Rabbi Shimon asked the kasha on Rava. Rabbi Shimon says, you had a mincha. So we know by Zevachim, we learned all the halachas of Lishma, Shaloi Lishma, by Pesach and Chatos. It's not kosher by other Kabbalis. It's kosher, El Shaloi. What about a mincha? So they're going to be kosher. And they will be Why? It's very, very different. Because there's a very clear distinction between menachos and zevachim. By menachos, it's quite clear what you're doing. For instance, what if you're a koimetz, a minchas machvas, and you had in mind that you're doing a minchas marcheshes? It's obvious that you're doing a machvas. It's a different type of mincha. It looks different. So therefore, or you might be having kavana, and you might even speak out, I'm having kavana for minchas marcheshes. But it's obvious you're working right there on the minchas machvas. So ma'aseh mechichanula shei machvas, or chareva l'shem belula. You were making a kmitza on a mincha of a choite, which you don't bring with oil, and you said l'shem a type of mincha that you brought with oil. Again, it's obvious there's no oil there. Because the shechita of one carbon is identical to the shechita of all carbonis. The ma'aseh that you do is exactly the same, no matter what type of carbon you're bringing. But the menachos, the ma'aseh that you're doing is different. So, what do we see from Reb Shimon's comments? The only reason why by a mincha really has the same halacha that shaloi lishma is not going to be good. Nervos by mincha different because the mitzvah shows what you're doing. So therefore, your kavanah is bottle because it's going to connect the mitzvahs. But technically speaking, if you didn't have that technical difficulty, that mitzvahs that shows that you're working on the right type of mincha, loy. Out the psukim alone, theoretically, the halacha would be the same. So the halacha of shechting is the same as the halacha as mincha shaloi l'shma would be possible. It's just that it's impossible to have a shaloi l'shma by mincha because it's obvious that the mincha that you're working on is obvious. What? What do you mean doesn't work? It's because your kavanah of shaloi l'shma has no validity. Because if you're working on a minchas machvas and you say, or you have kavanah to be working on minchas mecheshes, it doesn't help because the metzias clearly contradicts that your machshav is wrong. But if when I shech the chatas, I have in mind to shech the noila, my machshava is valid. It's wrong, but it's valid. So frag the more amai lema zois taris hamincha. What you just said a moment ago is by chatos, if you had kavanah for the wrong type of chatos, it's not going to be considered shaloi lishma. You know why? Because anything in the chatos family would be good. So why do we say the same thing over here? Anything in the mincha family is good. Why does it shouldn't have to say it's because of a technical difficulty? Because the mitzias it can't be shaloi lishma because the mitzias contradicts your kavanah. Rabbi Shimon could have said no. It says zois taris hamincha. No matter what mincha you have kavanah for, as long as it's part of the mincha family, it's going to be good enough. Why not darshan mincha like you darshan chatos? Ella itmar hachi itmar. Therefore, we're going to have to change the original halacha that we quoted from Avok, and we can't say chatos sheshach l'shon chatos nachshon kshera because of the zois taris chatos. Because by mincha you don't say that. So what do we have to say? Aliyat hachi itmar. Amar benasha. Amar ab mishmei demavuk. Chatos sheshachto al menashe yiskaper ba nachshon kshera. Now it's not a shinui kodesh. You didn't shech this type of chatos for that type of chatos. That might be a problem. But rather you shechted a chatos, instead of having in mind to be mechaper Ruvain, you had in mind sheyischaper ba nachshon. Well, nachshon is not really around. So you had kavanah to a person that doesn't exist. Kshera. You know why? Because ain't kapar l'mesim. If you had kavanah to be mechaper your chatos on some other person, so there you would say shaloi l'shem bailam. But to a dead person, that has no shaykhis. So that wouldn't be a problem because it has no shaykhis. Frek the Gemara, if that's the case, why was Mavuk's example nachshon? The halacha should have been if someone shechts achatos l'shem, someone who's not alive, it will still be kosher. That's what he should have said. Vosab is nachshon. It must be that Halkamash Malon, there's a unique Kiddush involving Nachshon, and that is time of the mace. The only reason why having in mind to shecht it for Nachshon is not going to passel is because he's dead. Hachai dumya de Nachshon. Well, what if you had kavanah for Chai similar to Nachshon, meaning a Chai who has no chiyuv whatsoever? A Chai, you were supposed to shecht Reuven's chatos, and instead you shechted it for Shimon, and Shimon has no chiv chatos. Shimon has no aver that would require him to bring a chatos. Psula, that would be possible. Now, how could you have in mind for a chatos, for a person who's not mechiv a chatos? What type of chatos does somebody bring if he's not mechiv a chatos? If he didn't do an aver? Umayniu chatos nozer v'chatos mitzoyra. So what happens if someone shechs a chatos? Reuven was bringing a chatos because he did an aver, he ate chayla, and the shoichet shechted it l'shem achatos nozer, l'shem achatos mitzoyra, similar to the chatos nachshon, which is a chatos that you bring, but it's not to be mechaper on an avera. that in fact would be possible. Frag the Gemara, I don't understand. Why would it be possible? Hani oilos ninu. Achatas Nazar and Achatas Mitzorah. Since they're not coming to be mechaper on a specific Avera, they are considered oilos. They're considered oilos. And if they're considered oilos, having kavana to shech the carbon almanah somebody who's only chayiv an oila, we said that's not going to pass over it at all. So weiter, why would it be possible? That doesn't make sense. Let's have a look at Rashi. Hani oilos ninu vanan kimlom chata sheshachta al mishin chayiv oilos ksheira. V'hani ka'oila dami. These are like an oila because they're not coming to be mechaper on an avera. So now the Gemara is saying a chiddush that a chatas nozer and a chatas mitzayra, we don't perceive it like a chatas. We perceive it like an oila, and therefore, if you shechted a chatas l'shem a chatas nozer, a chatas mitzayra, that's not even a machshava that can be chal. It's like shechting it on a dead man. Ella itmar hachit. So we have to once again revamp what Mavuk said. Amarav mishmei de Mavuk chatas sheshachta al shemechuyev chatas kinachshoin sheira. If you shechted a chatas on behalf of somebody who is, I'm just looking at the lashon of the Bach in Beis, chatas kinachshoin sheira. So chatas shechta al shemechuyev chatas kinachshoin sheira. Zokt the Bach sticks in pirish the hare the hachi hava dina b'shinui bailam. So we're talking about shinui bailam. You shechted it on somebody that was mechuyev chatas nachshon sheira. What does that mean? That means you shechted it not with a shinui kodesh, but rather with a shinui bailam, and you shechted it for somebody who owed a chatas like nachshon, meaning he was mechuyev a chatas, but he wasn't mechuyev the chatas of a chatas chaylev, rather the chatas of nachshon sheira. Frank the Gemara, what do you mean? Chatas nachshon oilahi. Zok the Gemara, ika de Amar Rav mishmei de Mavog chatas sheshachta l'shem chatas nachshon psula. There are those who learn that what Mavog said, that chatas sheshachta l'shem chatas nachshon is going to be psula because chatas nachshon oilahi. Because that's going to be an oila. So let's see Rashi. I'm getting a little bit mixed up over here. So let's see. If you shecht the chatas on someone who's mechuyev chatas like nachshoin, sheira will be kosher. And the Bach says it will be kosher the hachi avedina b'shinui bailam. Oh, because b'shinui bailam it would be kosher because this is someone who's only mechuyev like what is an oilahi. And iko de amar Rab Mishmei de Mavul chatas sheshachta l'shem chatas nachshon, which is a shinui kodesh, that will be psula because chatas nachshon oilahi, and that's like you're shechting a chatas l'shem oila. Shechting a chatas l'shem oila will be possible, but shechting a chatas on behalf of somebody who's mechuyev an oila, that's where we say that it won't be possible. Chatas nachshon oilahi. In fact, the Gemara v'leima chatas nazir v'chatas mitzayra. Why would Mavuk say a modna case? I'm shechting my chatos l'shem chatos nachshoin. All what we're really trying to tell you is it's a chatos that doesn't come for an avera that's chayiv kares. So pick something that's more relevant, like chatos mitzayra or chatos nazir. Right? Those are also examples of chatois that are not mechaper on the chayiv creases. Zok Gemara ikar chatos nakat. You know why the Mavuk Chapta and Chatas Nachshon is unusual as it is? It's the first occurrence in the Torah of a Chatos that's not coming to be Mechaper on the Isser Chaylev. So it represents any type of Chatos that's not coming to be Mechaper on an Isser of Karis is represented by Chatas Nachshon. Because that was the first one, and that's what the Tana means. And that's what Mavuk means. All Mavuk means is that if you shecht a Chatos, l'shem Chatos, a chatas that's like a noila, like a chatas nazar and a chatas mitzvah or chatas nachshon, it will be psul.
Why was it brought?
I'm sorry.
Why was it?
Chatas nachshon?
Yeah.
That was brought by the Nisim.
Yeah.
So it wasn't for an avera.
It wasn't for. It was just brought.
Yeah, it's
No,
exerts a
no.
cause that they brought a chatas. I mean, I'm sure it's mechaper on something, but it's definitely not for a specific violation of a chiv
identified
koros.
anywhere.
So why is it called chatas at all?
Because it's probably being mechaper for something. The reason why I
Who says it's being
it's like a chatas nosh and a chatas mitzayir. They did it
the
in the Veira.
Nesiim were presents, okay, for the Chanukas HaMishkan, all of them. They came along with a whole list of other stuff, the wagons and the all sorts of stuff.
Kapois all.
Yeah. So who says it's a chatas? I don't get it. It was a gift. It
The
should be a
Torah calls it a
shlamim.
chatas.
Pardon me?
The Torah calls it a chatas.
It does.
Yeah, the Torah calls it a chatas. And the same thing, the chatas nosh and chatas mitzayir. We know there are some avera, like the Gemara asks, what was avera of the Nazir? It's because he held himself back from wine, right?
Okay.
Or the Mitzayir spoke lashon hara, but it's not for a chayv krisus.
But this is at the Chanukas HaMishkan. It's
Well, you have to understand the reason all the Nesiim were married, weren't they? So they're for sure guilty.
okay. I'll accept that. All right.
Omar Rav, chatos chelev sheshachta l'shem chatos da. What happens if someone is mechuyev a chatos because he ate chelev b'shoikik and it was shechta l'shem chatos dam? That's mamish the same type of chatos, or l'shem chatos avoidus kachavim, or l'shem chatos of avoidus kachavim. Sheira, it'll be kosher. That's close enough that it's not considered a shinui kodesh. But l'shem chatos nazir, l'shem chatos mitzayra, that's going to be psula, because again, hani oila is ninu, we consider that an oila, even though technically it was called a chatos, but its purpose seems to be not much different than an oila. Boy Rava, chatos chelev sheshachta l'shem chatos the tumas mikdash v'kadoshim. We have many different types of chatos. We have the chatos of tumas mikdash v'kadoshim, or any one of their various where it's an oila v'yored. So you shechted a chatos chelev l'shem the chatos of an oila v'yored. Mao, miarinon karis kamoisa. Do you say that it's considered the same min? It's not like mitzvah. It's not like nazir, because lemaisa tumas mikdash v'kadoshav could also involve a chiyuv karis. Aydilma ain't kavu kamoisa. Or say no, it's not a chatos like a chatos chelav, because if the guy didn't have money, he would have brought an oith or maybe even a mincha. So therefore, it's not the same carbon. So the question is this close enough to be considered the same carbon, and it's not going to be a violation of Shinu Kodesh? Rabacha Berei Rava Masni Hulu L'Psula. He learned that even if you had it L'Shem Chatas Nazir, L'Shem Chatas Mitzayra, even if you had it L'Shem Avodas Kachavim, everything will be possible. Everything will be possible. Even L'Shem Avodas Kachavim, even a Chatas Chelev that you had in mind for a Chatas Dam, or a Chatas Dam for a Chatas Chelev, where it's mamish the same Avera, the same type of Avera, it would still be possible. My timer, v'shachat oisa l'chatos l'shem oisa chatos. The carbon, the chatos, has to be shechted for the very specific avera that triggered the chiyuv chatos. So if that's the case, then Rava shaila can't be a shaila. If even a chatos chelev that you shechted l'shem chatos dam, or a chatos dam that you shechted l'shem chatos chelev, if that's going to be possible, surely if you shechted a chatos chelev l'shem tumas mikdash v'kadoshav l'shem a carbon oil v'yored. So, Frank Gemara, based on what Rav Acha, the Rava is saying, that they're all possible, Amar Rav Ashi, Rav Acha by the Rava, then boy the Rava, Heichi Masninala. Where do you have Rava Shaila? If you're even a Chatas Chelev that you shechted l'shem a Chatas Dam, Rava holds will be possible. Surely a Chatas Chelev that you shechted l'shem a Chatas of Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav should be possible. Amalei says you're right. That's not what Rava Shaila was. Anan b'shini b'ayla masninala. Rava Shaila was not if you shechted a chatos chelev l'shem a chatos of a carbon oil of a yored. Rather, it's if you shechted it on behalf of a different person who was over a different type of an avera. Amar Rava chatos chelev sheshachta al mi shemechuyev chatos dam v'chatos avodas kachavim psula. If you shech a chatas chelev instead of for Ruvain, you shech it for Shimon, and Shimon happens to be anyway mechuyev a chatas dam, or Shimon has to be anyway mechuyev a chatas of the chavim, then it's psula because he's in the ballpark. But al misha mechuyev chatas nazir the chatas mitzayra ubikshera. right? Just like an oila, right? If you shech nechatos l'shem somebody who's only mechuyev an oila, we learned that's not even a valid kavanah, and it wouldn't possible. And therefore, chatos nazar and chatos mitzayra are like an oila, and if you shechted l'shem somebody who was mechuyev a chatos nazar and a chatos mitzayra will be kosher. So on the one side, you have chatos nazar and chatos mitzayra, which are like an oila, and for sure, shechting l'shem somebody who owes those would not be a pasal machshava. It wouldn't be a valid machshava. And on the other side, you have a chatas dam that was shechted l'shem somebody who owes a chatas chelav, or a chatas dam l'shem somebody who owes a chatas avodah kavim. That is close enough, and that would be a kavanah that would pass it. And the question is that when you come up the middle, Levayin lahachi, boy Rava, what about a chatas chelav sheshachta on mishu mechuyev chatos the tumas mikdash v'gadoshav? That's sort of in the middle. Mao, is that considered a valid kavanah? Miyamrin and karish kamoisa. So therefore, it's similar enough that your machshava of shaloi l'shem bailim is going to be a valid machshava and it'll pass the carbon. Idilma ein kavua kamoisa. It's a different type of carbon. It's like an oila, and therefore your kavanah to shechlet l'shem somebody who owed the carbon early yored is not a valid kavanah, and it wouldn't pass. Take him. Gavalti. Itmar shachta l'shma lizrak dama shaloi l'shma. You shechted a carbon. Now we know when it comes to shinui bailim, that's the only way it passes. If you shechted it, amanas lizrak shaloi l'shem bailim. But when it comes to the shchita or shaloi l'shem kodesh, shechting a carbon wrong, what if you shechted a carbon, but lizrak dama shaloi l'shma? But he had in mind, I'm shechting my chatos l'shem chatos, but when I do this rika, I plan to do this rika l'shem oila. Would that passel al shinu kodesh? Or maybe the machshava only passels the avoda that I'm working on. The machshava for a different avoda won't passel the avoda that I'm on. Rabbi Yochanan or Psula, Rabbi Yochanan would passel for Shlokish HaMaksheva. Rabbi Yochanan or Psula, because he holds mechashvin me avoda leavoda v'alfinim mechshavas pigel. You know, by pigel, the halacha is you're shechting now almanas to eat it chut lizmanai or chut l'mkoimai. So there clearly it's mechashvin me avoda leavoda, because the avoda that I'm doing perfectly. I'm having kavanah to do something later wrongfully. That's mamish a case of mechashim avodah lavodah, except achila is not an avodah, but it's definitely passing this shchita because of a machshava that I had about doing something else wrong, even though the shchita I'm doing perfectly right. So therefore, let's say that same svara that applies by pigel applies to the machshava of shaloi lishma. For shlokish hamakshera ein mechashim me'avodah lavodah. And and they have a similar machlokes, which seems to illustrate the same discussion. The itmar we learned. You shechted an animal. Now this is not a carbon. This is a regular animal of chulin. If you shecht an animal of avodah, the animal becomes also bana. But what if you shechted it for chulin? But you had in mind that you were going to spritz its blood, or ulahakter chelbo. Would that make this carbon into an avodah zarah? Rabbi Yochanan or Asura, because mechashvin me avodah lavodah. Even though your shchita was perfect, but since while you did the shchita, you had kavanah to do the zrika avodah zarah, and you didn't do the zrika avodah zarah yet. All you did was you shechted it with the kavanah that you're going to do the zrika avodah zarah. It will pass. Why? Mechashvin me avodah lavodah v'yafin chutz mipnim. And you say the same halacha that applies by a carbon, like by pigel, applies by chulin, which is we call chutz. Muteres, because ein mechashin me'avoid levoida v'loyafin chutz mipnim. You cannot compare this to pigel. By pigel is a chiddush that a kavanah to do a later ma'aseh wrongfully would impact your current ma'aseh. But when it comes to avodah zarah and chulin, only if you actually do the action, the avodah for avodah zarah. So why do I need the machlokes in both places? Basically, the shaila is very simple. This chiddush that we learn from pigel, that exists by pigel, where you have kavanah, you're doing a ma'aseh perfectly, but you're just having a kavanah to do a later action wrongfully, that'll passel this ma'aseh. It's the same shaila. Do you learn from pigel elsewhere or not? So why did Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish have to express their machlokes in both places? The Yashmin and Baha Amar Rish Lakish. Maybe only over here Rish Lakish said, meaning in our case, with having a kavana in the shchita to do this rika, to have kavanah in the shechita of a carbon to do the zrika l'shem a different carbon. Aval panim mipanim, ema moidilei l'Rabbi Yochanan. I'm sorry. So maybe in the case of shechting a chulin dika animal avodah zarah, there Reish Lakish holds you cannot learn chutz from panim. But if they're both a case of panim, for instance, pigel is a case of panim, and the shiloh that we had on Amud Aleph, when you're shechting a chatos, l'shem carbon chatos, but while you're shechting the chatos, you have in mind to do this rika l'shem oila, that Reish Lakish would agree that it would passel. And if we only had the case on Amud Aleph, in our case, where you're shechting a chatas almanas to do the zrika of the chatas l'shem oila, then I would say, but how come Rabbi Yochanan? Maybe only there did Rabbi Yochanan say mechash v'mei avoda l'avoda. Avol bahi, but in the case of chulin, that's maybe Rabbi Yochanan would be that's too far away from pigol. Even moidele l'Reish Lakish trichi. So that's why the machlokes is in both places to illustrate that sai by chulin that you're shechting l'avoda zara, sai by a carbon that you're shechting almanas to do the zrika l'shem the wrong carbon. They're arguing in both places if you say mechashvin me'avoda l'avoda. Kasher Rav Dimi Omar. Mosav Rabbi Yirmiyah l'siyuyei Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Yirmiyah had a kasha to prove Rabbi Yochanan shita that mechashvin me'avoda l'avoda. Rabbi Ila l'siyuyei l'Reish Lakish. And Rabbi Ila brought a kasha that would prove ein mechashvin me'avoda l'avoda. So let's have a look. Rabbi Yirmiyah l'siyuyei Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yirmiyah wanted to bring a rise to Rabbi Yochanan that mechashvin me'avoda l'avoda. And this was his kasha. Uma b'mokim shim Omar hareini shoichet chut l'zmanoi. Shehu kosher. If a guy is shechting, a guy's about to shecht. He didn't start shechting yet. He's about to shecht. And he said, when I shecht, in a moment, I'm going to have in mind to shecht chut l'zmanoi. That's kosher. There's no Isser Pigel. The Isser Pigel is that during the shechita, you have in mind to eat it chut l'zmanoi, or to make the zrika chut l'zmanoi. But before the shechita, if you say, I'm shechting, I'm going to shecht chut l'zmanoi, it has zero impact. So, Uma, b'mokim, shim amar areinu shecht chut l'zmanoi, shu kosher. It will have zero impact on the carbon. It'll be kosher. Nevertheless, shachtoi, almanas lizrak, domai chut l'zmanoi, puzzle, that's mamish a case of pigel, where there's a chiv karish if you eat it. Mokim, she'im amar hareinu shecht shaloi l'shmoi. In our case, where if you said before the shechita, I'm going to be shechting this chatos l'shem oila, that's possible for sure. That's mamish the textbook example of shaloi l'shmoi. So makim shem amar and yishach tzlosh my puzzle shachta amnas lizark damai shaloi l'shmoi ain't a dinshu puzzle. Madach by the avoid itself your puzzle, which by pigel wouldn't be. Kol shekain if you're shechting to do something else, which by pigel would puzzle. Kol shekain here it should puzzle as well. So you have a riot that mechashvin may avoid the lavoida even when it comes to a machshav of shaloi l'shmoi. Maskav lo Rabbi Bar Hiloi. That's not a good kash at all. You know why? Because malach chutz l'zmanoi shekein kares. You know why bechutz l'zmanoi if you're mechashvin me'avoda l'avoda? Because it has another chumrah. It has the chumrah of a chiv kares. The pigel of chutz l'zmanoi comes with a chiv kares. But there's no chiv kares for somebody who has kavana to shecht an oila when he's really shechting the chatos. There's no chiv kares involved. So your whole raya is not a raya. So what is the kasha? Ella Amar Rabbi Bar Eloi Hachi Kamar. This is what the kasha that we're bringing a raya, that Rabbi Yirmiyah is bringing a raya to Rabbi Yochanan. Uma mokoim shim Amar hareini shoichet chutz l'mkoimai shu kosher. There's a different type of pigel. The pigel of chutz l'mkoimai, I refer to that as baby pigel. Why do I call it baby pigel? Because that doesn't have a chiv kares. Chutz l'mkoimai does not have a chiv kares. So uma mokoim shim Amar hareini shoichet chutz l'mkoimai shu kosher. Yet shachta almanas lizrak damei chutzim kaimei would be possible. Mokom shim amar hareini shoichet shaloi l'shmoi shel possible. Shachta almanas lizrak damei shaloi l'shmoi ain't it didn't shei possible. So it's exactly the same kind of karma we made a moment ago, but instead of using the pigel of chutz l'zmanoi, which comes with a chiv kares, we're using the pigel of chutz l'kaimei, which doesn't have a chiv kares. So you can no longer ask me the kasha that maybe by pigel it's different because it's a chiv kares. Because even pigel without a chiv kares, you see the concept of machashvin me'avoida l'avoida. I'm sorry? There's no chiv kares, correct. So frag to Gemara Shalav. Frag to Gemara Matzka for Rabashi, that's also not a good kash. Because chutz l'kaimei also has a chumrah that you don't have by shaloi l'shma. Mal chutz l'kaimei shekein noeg b'chol Zevachim. Guess what? Chutz l'kaimei passes every type of carbon. The psul of Shalei Shemai is not such a stark psul. You know why? Because it only applies to two carbonas, chatos and pesach. But pigel applies to everywhere. So Viter, you can't be mirai from pigel that you should be mechashiv me'avoda l'avoda. Alam Rashi Hachikamar. This is what Rabbi Yirmiyah must have had a raya to Rabbi Yochanan. Uma b'mokai shim amar hareini shoichet l'shem ploini. Madich in the case of not shinu kodesh but shinu bailim. Madich by shinu bailim, where you could only pass during the shechita if by the shechita you have in mind to do the zrika shaloi l'shema. So madich in the case of shinu bailim. Shim amar hareini shoichet l'shem ploini. Shu kasher if you shecht l'shem Shimon, when the carbon belongs to Reuven, that won't answer it all. It only answers it if you said, I'm shechting it, I'm anas to do the zrika, l'shem, the wrong person, l'shem Shimon. So again, a case of Shinu Bailam, Shu Kasher, Lizrak Dami l'shem Pliny, possible. But if you shechted, I'm anas Lizrak Dami l'shem Pliny, would be possible. Makaim. So by a case of Shinu Kodesh, Makaim Shim Amar in Yishaichet Shalishman, Shu Pasul, Shachta Amnas Lizak Daman Shalishman, Einodin, Sheyeh Pasul. And that was the great raya that Rabbi Yirmiyah brought to Rabbi Yochanan, the Mechashim Avoda Lavoda. We're not bringing a raya from Pigel. We're bringing a raya Minei Ubei from our own sugya of Shaloi Lishma, but from the Shaloi Lishma of Shaloi Lishon Bailim. By Shinu Bailim, clearly it only works when you're shechting Almanas to do the Zrika. So you see Mechashvin Me'avoda Lavoda Minei Ubei in the sugya of wrong kavanas, of the improper kavanas, and therefore it's mistaber that even by Shinu Kodesh, if you shechted it l'shem to do the zrika to the wrong carbon, it would pass. Now we also said that Rabbi Elah brought a raya l'siyuya l'rish lakish to prove that ain't Mechashvin Me'avoda Lavoda. What was his raya? He had a kasha. Loi taimar bezrika. We brought psukim a couple of blot ago to identify how each avoida has to be done lishma. And one of the psukim was also for the zrika. The question is, why in the world did the Gemara need to bring a special pasuk to say that the zrika has to be lishma? We already knew that the shechita has to be done lishma. We already had a pasuk that the shechita has to be done lishma. We already had a pasuk that the kabbalah has to be done lishma, and therefore the halach has to be done lishma. So why can't they learn if the shechita and the kabbalah have to be done lishma? Who's in the zrika? Why do I need a pasuk for the zrika? V'teisi mikal v'chomer mibinaya mishchita v'kabbalah. What would be the raya? Zokt Rashi. The raya would be mishchita v'kabbalah umashchita sheksher bizar. Madach shchita that sheksher bizar is psula b'shaloi lishma zrika l'kol shekein. Now, if you're going to ask malach shchita shekein poiselas shaloi l'shem oichlem b'pesach, remember we said that shchita has a chumrah because only shchita has a psul that if you shechted a carbon pesach and there's no one who's in the group can eat it, it would be possible that the chumrah only to shchita. I'll say kabbalah techiach because kabbalah doesn't have that chumrah. So between shchita and kabbalah, we will automatically know zrika. So why l'mahilchos a kaza rechmana? So why did the Torah say zrika? Loimar, it must be to teach us that in mechashvin me'avoda lavoda. Since the Torah is telling us about zrika that it has to be done l'shema, and it's not necessary for the Torah to tell us that, it must be telling us a chiddush that in mechashvin me'avoda lavoda. Daf if you had kavanah by the zrika shaloi l'shema, but if you had kavanah by the shchita or by the kabbalah to do the zrika shaloi l'shema, that wouldn't pass it. Now the problem with this line in the Gemara is very simple. Let's go look up that Gemara. Where is that Gemara? That Gemara is, if you look at the Bach Zayin tells exactly where it is, even though we shouldn't need a Bach. By now we should know where it is. But the Bach Zayin tells us that it is on La'il Daf Dalid Amar Aleph. So let's look at Daf Dalid Amar Aleph, and this Gemara will come back to you, and you'll see that the Gemara slugged up this Memitzinu, because the Gemara asked, why do we need a pasuk for Zrika? Let's learn it out of Shchita and Kabbalah. The Gemara asked that question. You remember when the Gemara was going through all the psukim, the Gemara proved that you can't learn any one from the other. So let me go back and take a look over here. It says over here, by the Shlomim, it says, hazoyik es dam shlomim shetezrika l'shlem shlomim. Break the Gemara. So let's go further up. V'chitema leilaf mahani. Why do I need a pasuk for Zrika? Let me learn Zrika from Shchita and Kabbalah, which the Gemara right now just told us you can easily do it. But look what the Gemara says, you can't do that. Malahani, she came to Unois Tzafoin, v'yeshton v'chatois ha'pnimiyos. Shchita and Kabbalah have to be done on the Tzafoin, and Shchita and Kabbalah are avoidance that you do by the chatois ha'pnimiyos. But Zrika on the on the Mizbech HaChitzoin, you don't do by the chatois ha'pnimiyos. Because by the chatois ha'pnimiyos, you spritz the blood on the Mizbech HaPnimi, not on the Mizbech HaChitzoin. So therefore, since Shchita and Kabbalah have a chumrah that Zrika doesn't have, you need the pasuk for Zrika. Now our Gemara conveniently forgets about that whole idea and says suddenly you could learn it out of Shchita and Kabbalah. So Tosfos bamerks this kasha, but the answer is that we're talking about, the Gemara is going to bring it up. We're talking about shlomim now. A shlomim doesn't have din of tzafay, right? And the shlomim is not a chatas pnimi, never is pnimi. So in Mela, that kasha with which we shlogged up that you can't learn shrika from Shechita and Kabbalah might apply to a chatas, but it wouldn't apply to a shlomim. So therefore, why do we need shrika? It must be to tell you a chiddush of the ein mechashvin me'avoid lavoida. Matzkel var papa. Fracture Papa, I don't understand. Maybe Pukvigar. Maybe the fact that it was written extra Rika is the Pukvigar. The Machashim may avoid Lavoida. Maybe the fact that it says Rika, it shouldn't have said it, is to tell you Pukvigar. Like, where do you see a Hechocha that it's telling you that ain't Machashim may avoid Lavoida? So tomorrow I'll tell you why. Because if you held Machashim may avoid Lavoida, then why do I need any pasuk at all? Imkain lishtik kramine. The Torah should have never spoken out Rika. We don't need it. And we could have learned it from the Kavachaimer of Rashi. Madach shinu bailim, you are machashim me'avoid lavoida. Kol shkein shinu kodesh. You're going to apostle. You're going to be machashim me'avoid lavoida. So it must be if it says Rika and it didn't need it, and the default would have been machashim me'avoid lavoida. Rika tells you ein machashim me'avoid lavoida. Ve'idich parachachi. The man the Amar who argues, meaning Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that mechashim me'avoid lavoida, he says malahanich shekain tunay safon v'yeshtem b'chatois ha'pnimiyos. Exactly how the Gemara slugged it up earlier. Ve'idach, but Rish Lakish holds no. You can't ask the kasha because hashta miyah b'shlomim kayomin. Since we're discussing shlomim, you can't bring me a chumrah that Shchita and Kabbalah have in some other area. In shlomim, they don't have this chumrah. Okay, so basically, what we had a machloikis. If mechashim and me'avoid lavoida, when it comes to shinu kodesh, if you had kavanah by the shchita to do the zrika shaloi l'shma, and there was a machloikis of brech and Rish Lakish, we brought rise back and forth, but we have a machloikis. Now we're going to bring the same machloikis with two other mandamim arguing about the same machloikis. It mashak l'shma, lizrak dama shaloi l'shma, Rav Nachman and Rav Psula, Rabbi Merkshera. Exactly, Rabbi was like Rish Lakish, Rav Nachman was like Rabbi Yochanan, v'hadu be'Rava lagabi Rav Nachman, and Rabbi was muddy to Rav Nachman that it's mechashim me'avoid levoida mikavachomer Rav Ashi, because Rav Ashi mikavachomer from shinu bailim, it proves that shinu kodesh is even if you had the kavanah during the shchita about this recall. About the Rabbi Eliezer Omer, af ha'osham. Rabbi Eliezer said that an osham is like a chatos. It's mechaper, and therefore, if you're going to bring the Asham Shalom Shema, it will be possible just like the Chatos is possible. Tanya Amar Beliezer, Chatos Baal Chet, Vasham Baal Chet, Ma Chatos Shalom Shema Psula, Af Asham Shalom Shema Possible. Aval Rabbi Yeshua, no, Lo Yamamrit Chatos Shekain Dama Lamaila. Chatos has a chumrah. The dam is spritzed on the mizbeach above the chut sikra, above on the top half of the mizbeach. The dam of the Asham is only spritzed on the bottom half of the mizbeach. So maybe Dafka Chatos, which is more chomer, has to be l'shem kodesh. If not, it's possible, but maybe an usher will be kosher. Amalei Beliezer, no, Pesach yachiach. Pesach is also possible. Shalom l'shma shadami l'mata, and b'shak l'shalom l'shma is possible. Amalei B'Shua, don't be meraf in Pesach. Mala Pesach shekein zaman le'kavua, and that's a different chomer. Amalei Beliezer, chadat yachiach. Amalei Rabbi Yeshua, so Rabbi Yeshua said, you're going back and forth. I'll go back and forth. So Yisrani Chalila, you're going in circles, and I'll say the same thing. That malachatos, that the zrika is lamaila mechut asikra on the top half of the mizbeach. Zok to Gemara, Chazer Rabbi Eliezer v'danu din acher. So Rabbi Eliezer decided to make a different right. Chatos nemerba he b'shchita. When it talks about the shchita of the carbon chatos, it says the samach yodeh al reish asar v'shachadayis b'mkam ha'shishach d'soila l'fnei Hashem chatos hu. It says chatos hu. I don't know why the Gemara says he. Chatos he lishma sheira shelo lishma psula upesach nemerba hu b'zvicha. It says a lashon hu by zvicha. It says v'amatim zevach pesach hu lashem, and therefore we learn hu lishma kosher shelo lishma pasuk. And af Asham, Dr. Belazer, Asham has the same thing. Remember by who? It also says who. It says by the Asham, Victor Hashem Mizbecha, Ishal Hashem, Asham who? Dr. Gemara, who Lishmai, Kasher, Shalom Lishmai Pasal. Amar Rabbi Yeshua, this is the famous Rabbi Yeshua, we had it many times. Chatos never bahi, where when you talk about the Shechita. And therefore we learn he Lishma Ksher, Shalom Lishma Psula. Pesach, it says he also about his Zvicha. Never bahi Bezvicha, who Lishmai Kasher, Shalom Lishma Pasal. Aval Asham, you know where it says who? After the Haktara. Asham loy nemer boy who elalach Haktara, elalach Haktara seimurin, who atzmoy shloy huktu remur of kosher. If you don't even do any Haktara, let's say you don't put the emur on the mizbeach at all, it's going to be kosher. So if you put it on, you're going to learn that it's ma'akev, that it should be l'shma. You don't even have to put it on. So the who by Asham clearly is not telling you the same Allah. Amar Lezer, Harei Oimer, I have another reason to prove that the Asham will be posel shaloi l'shma, just like the Chatos. Because there's a hekesh. It is kachatos ka'asham. Ma chatos shaloi l'shma posel, of Asham shaloi l'shma posel. Okay. Amar Rabbi Shua, chazreini chalila. We had a problem. Because Rabbi Lezer says, I want to bring a rye from Pesach. He said, no, Pesach is chomer because Pesach has a chumrah that it's mani kavua. So then he said, okay, I'll bring a rye from Chatos. No, Chatos has a chumrah, and the dam is spritzed above on the top half of the mizbeach. But what about a ma'atan? We know whenever you have two different sources and they each have two different chumras, you could say Hashava Atara Shava Shabehen that they're karbonos and Shalosh Mother Apostles who did not sham. So Frank Amar Rabbi Shua Chazreni Chalila. What do you mean Chazreni Chalila? Well, how do you do it? Well, matzad. So Kamar Mishum Dikal Mifrach Mal Atara Shava Shabehen. You know what Pesach and Chatos have in common? Shekain Yesh Ben Tzadkares. They both have a shaykhis to kares. Achatos is to be mechaper in the isakares. The carbon pesach, if you are able to bring the carbon pesach and you know when you don't bring it, you're chayav kares. So it has an angle. There's an angle of kares there, and therefore there's a chumrah. That's why shaloi l'shma will be possible. But Al-Asham doesn't have that. Amalei Rabbi Yeshua lo yimamrit bechatos shekein dam l'mayla. Rabbi Yeshua's response to Rabbi Elazar was, don't bring me a rye from a chatos, because chatos, the dam is spritzed l'mayla, on the top half of the mizbeach. V'lei malei, why was that Rabbi Yeshua's raya? Rabbi Yeshua could have had a different time. V'lei malei, lo yimamrit bechatos, shekein nichnas dama lifnayu lifnim. Why didn't Rabbi Yeshua say that, no, you know why it's more chomer? You know why a chatos is more chomer? Because sometimes a chatos, the dam of the chatos, is brought into the heichal itself, into the kodesh HaKadoshim itself. So that makes the chalas more chomer. No, the reason why Rabbi Shua didn't say that time is b'chatois hachitzonis kaminon, because we're talking about chatois chitzonis, where the dam is not brought lefnai v'lefnim. Fakir shem nichnas dam lefnai lefnim psula would actually be possible. So therefore, he didn't use that as a raya. He used the fact that it spritzed on the top half of his bear. Zok Gemara shem nichnas dama lefnim psula is leila Rabbi Elazar afa osham. So Rabbi Elazar the osham should have the same chumrah. Why? Shekain mechaperes al chayve krisos mechatos the shmiyas hakoil shekain to. I'm sorry, mechatos the shmiyas hakoil. So Rabbi Elazar holds an osham, which is I'm sorry, I'm skipping it out. Frag Gemara, what about Shechein Mechaperes Al Chayve Krisos? Why didn't Rabbi Shua say you can't bring mirai from a chatos, because a chatos is mechaper and Chayve Krisos, but an osham is not, and therefore dafka chatos shaloi l'shma will be possible, but not a osham. Zok Gemara mechatos the shmiyas hakoil. You know which chatos Rabbi Eliezer bring a raya from to osham, from the chatos of shmiyas hakoil, where there is no chiv chorus. If someone heard Edus and he lies and he says he didn't hear Edus, there's no chiyuv chorus involved there. So that's the chatos where Rabbi Eliezer bring the raya from. So Zok the Gemara, Shekentuna arba matanos. So how about the fact that a chatos needs 4 matanos? When we say Eizom Akaiman, you need a matana on each one of the kronos, so you need 4 matanos. Mashenkin other kabbalas kanoshim is only shtayim shein arba. Zok the Gemara, Rabbi Shmuel. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer holds like Rabbi Shmuel, the Yomer Kol Adamim Tulin Arba Matanos. Even Shtayim Shen Arba means 4. It doesn't mean one Zrika that splits in half. You have to do a Zrika on one side of the point and a Zrika on the other side of the point. So in fact, every carbon would actually require 4 individual Zrikas. So that's not a Chumrah of Chatos. Maybe Shekain Tunal Arba Karnos. Maybe the Chumrah of Chatos is you have to spritz on top of each Karen, unlike on the side of the Mizbeach. Zok the Gemara, if you're going to look for all these little nitty-gritty areas in which a chatos is more chomer than an osham, I could give you a whole list. First of all, by a chatos, you have to do the spritzing with your finger. You can't just dump from the keli. Hoika karen, it has to be directly on the karen. Or chuda, if you don't hold the karen, you have to put it right on the point, which you don't have to do by other kabbalas. There's talking many different kashas that the Yeshua could have used to show that a chatos is more chamer than an osham and say that they're not comparable. He picked one. He picked the one that the dam is lamaila on the top half of his back. Okay, we'll stop here, and I guess we'll start here on Tzem Gedalia. We almost got there. Shkoyach.